There are a billion people on Facebook. There are more than 250 million tweets on Twitter every day. How do you police that? Should you even bother? People are being fined and even jailed for comments they've made online. And now the most senior prosecutor in England and Wales is trying to draw up guidelines he hopes will work. We'll hear from him after Jim Reid reveals a big rise in the number of complaints the police have been asked to investigate.
2 court cases this week, 2 ways in which the internet is now challenging the British legal system. Azhar Ahmed from Dewsbury was given a community sentence for posting angry comments about the death of British soldiers on Facebook. A day earlier, Matthew Woods went to jail for off-colour jokes about the missing schoolgirl April Jones. The comments, both made online, were unpleasant to most people, but should they also be illegal? 2 years ago, Paul Chambers became one of the first people to be found guilty of sending a threatening message on another social networking site, this time Twitter. He said he would blow his local airport sky high if it didn't reopen after heavy snowfall. His conviction was eventually overturned when the judge agreed it was just a bad joke.
The 2 cases this week show that nothing's been learnt at all. After my own verdict was given in the High Court, after my appeal was upheld, and after the DPP said guidance was going to be given to prosecutors, it looked as though positive steps were going to be taken and common sense was going to be applied. But now we've had the Woods and the Azhar Ahmed case with guilty verdicts found and ridiculous sentences given, that we're going backwards, if anything.
Many of the high-profile cases brought to trial so far use a little-known part of the law. Section 127 of the Communications Act makes it an offence to post menacing or grossly offensive material online.
If they want that to be properly American, they want to get one of the nerdy kids to come in with a rifle.
So, while a comedian can make an offensive joke on stage or even down the pub, exactly the same material online could, in theory, get someone arrested.
We think that the reason that this is happening is that the law that is being used, the Communications Act 2003, was simply not created for the purpose. Back in 2002, 2003, when this law was being drafted, no one had any idea that Facebook or Twitter or YouTube or any of these things would be such a part of people's lives. And it seems to me now that we are really clamping down on free speech just at a time when so many people have more access to communications and debates and arguments than ever before.
But this is not just about public figures, and it's not just about jokes. Police are now seeing a real increase in the number of general cases they're asked to investigate after threatening messages are posted on the internet. Newsnight asked every force for harassment cases involving Facebook and Twitter. In 2010, there were over 2,000 investigations, rising to almost 2,500 in 2011. That's now more than 50 a week across the UK. While some of those cases will be serious, police officers we've spoken to think they are now being dragged into too many petty rows. The Director of Public Prosecutions is now holding talks with lawyers, academics and the police to draw up new guidelines for the courts. It's likely websites themselves will be told to improve the way they take down offensive comments and ban repeat offenders, though Facebook and Twitter may be reluctant to go too far and really start to moderate or censor content themselves. This Is My Jam is a social music site based near London's Silicon Roundabout. One of the founders says it's just not practical for a small site to keep an eye on everything that's being said online.
We're not in a position where we want to surveil our users. There's no way that, with a team of 4 people, we could monitor thousands, hundreds of thousands of posts that go up every week. And ultimately, we wouldn't want to. That's not our job to police individual comments. What we're here to do is to impose to suggest some community guidelines and have the community discuss that between themselves.
The worry for many in the internet community is that any new guidelines, if they're too prescriptive, could put sites like this out of business. Get this wrong, they say, and it might make it harder, not easier, to work out where the limits are in the online world.
Well, Keir Starmer is the Director of Public Prosecutions, and he's been consulting with lawyers and police trying to find a sensible set of guidelines. When I spoke to him earlier, he told me he was worried about the chilling effect on free speech. But I asked him first what he's learned so far about dealing with offensive messages.
One of the difficulties here is that the law prohibits grossly offensive messages, and we've got to work within the law as it is. It occurs to me that amongst the many million communications that go on daily, quite a number would fall within that category. So we've got to see how the Crown Prosecution Service can act as some sort of filter or gatekeeper. The emerging thinking in the round tables is that it might be sensible to divide and separate cases where there's a campaign of harassment and social media is being used as the means of harassment, and cases where there's a credible and genuine threat, put them on one side and prosecute in those sorts of cases. But to put in another category, communications which are, as it were, merely offensive or grossly offensive. Doesn't mean the second category are ring-fenced from prosecution, but it does, I think, enable us to look at that group in a slightly different way.
How high, then, on that second subset, how high must the bar be? Because we've heard of people obviously going to jail for saying unpleasant things about missing children. Other people have been fined and given community service for saying unpleasant things in the future. Is that the sort of thing that it should be criminally investigated?
I think the threshold for prosecution has to be high.
Higher than I've just described?
Well, we live in a democracy, and if free speech is to be protected, there has to be a high threshold. People have the right to be offensive, they have the right to be insulting, and that has to be protected.
But that's pretty clear.
Context is everything, and I think the difficult cases so far have involved comments that have been made in a situation which is highly charged or emotional, and judgment calls have to be made about the particular context. But this is not easy. If this was easy, we wouldn't be having this debate. These are particularly difficult judgment calls. What I want to achieve is consistency and a fair balance in these cases.
But in future, for example, Matthew Woods, who was jailed for making comments when he did about the missing girl, April Jones, does that cross the bar?
Well, in that case, as you know, he pleaded guilty. The court sentenced him in the way they did. There are clearly strong views on either side here. Some say that's an infringement of free speech. On the other hand, the courts have taken it seriously. I think if one looks at what was actually said and asks the question, was it grossly offensive? I think the answer is yes, it was. There was some particularly offensive comments made. What I want to achieve in the guidelines is a sense of which of even the grossly offensive cases require a criminal prosecution.
It sounds like you'd like to see far fewer prosecutions.
I think if there are a lot of prosecutions, it'll have a chilling effect on free speech, and I think that's a very important consideration.
And who's going to police it? Facebook and Twitter are going to have to take on thousands of extra staff, or will it be, as it seems to be at the moment, left to users to police?
One of the participants in the round table was the policy director of Facebook, and I'm trying to set up meetings with the service providers, really to say to them, you've got a responsibility here. In many of these cases, the appropriate response may be for you to take this material down swiftly, and that may reduce the requirements for a criminal prosecution.
Are Facebook and Twitter and social media going to be treated differently? Is it going to be easier to be offensive on them still than it is on radio, on television, or in newspapers?
No, I think the thing about radio and television is there's a degree of regulation in any event. The thing about social media, Twitter, Facebook, is that the individual can move very swiftly from communicating to a few people to broadcasting to millions.
But my point is they're all integrated now, aren't they?
Oh yes, but I mean the offence covers all those types of communication, and that's where the problem lies.
Well, yes, but if I was to lie about you on television, if I was to sit here and say, I don't know, that you made up all your qualifications and you do unspeakable things to farm animals, the BBC, Ofcom, who knows, they'd come down on me like a ton of bricks. But if I tweeted that about you, judging by what you're telling me, you would just have to accept the offence.
Well, where there's a regulator, obviously I'd be able to complain to the regulator, and there may be a case for some sense of regulating in this area that is unregulated. But at the moment we have an overarching criminal offence that applies to all those communications. And I think that's part of the problem, because if a criminal response is the only available response, then there might be the temptation to resort too quickly to that response, whereas in other fields or other areas, the appropriate route might be by way of complaint or some other remedy.
Thank you very much.